A very good morning to all. Today we are here to discuss maternal near miss lessons learned. I bring greetings from Nagpur OBGY Society. We are thankful to FIGO for giving us chance to discuss on the topic maternal near miss in the international conference at Australia. We are going to discuss on the topic maternal near miss. Whenever there is maternal mortality, there is a lot of cry and hue. But whenever there is maternal near miss, it is not discussed. And after each maternal mortality, there are 20 near miss cases. Whenever a patient comes back from the clutches of death, it is all the efforts put by obstetricians at all the level to get that patient back. And so we will be discussing lessons learned from those near miss cases. So I invite our first panelist, Dr. Alka Mukherjee.
Namaskar, myself Dr. Alka Mukherjee. I am President, Nagpur OBGY Society. I am a private practitioner. My areas of interest are high-risk pregnancy, ultrasound and violence against doctors. Thank you.
Dr. Chaitanya Shembekar.
Hello, I am Dr. Chaitanya Shembekar. I am Director Omega Hospitals Nagpur and I am obstetrician gynecologist and IVF consultant.
Dr. Ashish Kubde.
I am Ashish Kubde. I am consultant at 7-Star Hospital Nagpur and presently I am secretary of the Nagpur OBGY Society.
Dr. Rajsi Sengupta.
Hello everybody, I am Dr. Rajasi Sengupta, consultant obstetrician and gynecologist at Sengupta Hospital, Nagpur. My area of interest is critical care obstetrics.
Dr. Sumit Baheti.
Hello everyone, myself Dr. Sumit Baheti. I am a consultant obstetrician gynecologist at Kingsway Hospital, Nagpur. My areas of interest are high-risk pregnancy management and infertility management.
Dr. Shantala Bhore.
Hello everyone, I am Dr. Shantala Bhole. I am a consultant gynecologist at 7-Star Hospital Nagpur. Currently I am the clinical secretary of Nagpur OBGY Society.
And myself, Dr. Pragati Kharatkar. I am treasurer for Nagpur OBGY Society and I am faculty for Pelvic Anatomy Revisited workshop and running Kharatkar Hospital for Mother and Child. Maternal near miss is a woman who survives life-threatening conditions during pregnancy, abortion, childbirth and within 42 days of pregnancy termination, irrespective of receiving medical and surgical interventions. There are various causes of maternal mortality like hemorrhage, hypertensive disorders, unsafe abortion, sepsis, obstructed labor and many unidentified causes. It was audited and found to add, as FIGO consensus, to add abortion complications, antepartum hemorrhage and reduce the number of transfusions to have a better insight into the study of near miss cases. So how we divide these cases, and WHO has recommended 3 criteria for labeling a patient as a near miss. First is disease-specific criteria such as severe preeclampsia or eclampsia, severe hemorrhage, sepsis, uterine rupture, management-based criteria, if she is admitted to ICU, if she requires obstetric hysterectomy, if there are massive blood transfusions or patient is requiring intubation or ventilation, and lab-based criteria where her saturation was less than 90% for 1 hour, when she had renal failure, creatinine more than 3.5, serum bilirubin more than 6, hepatic failure when she is in acidosis, pH is less than 7.1, when she has platelets less than 50,000 and when patient is in frank diabetic ketoacidosis. We will be discussing case-based discussion here. So, my first question to Dr. Alka is, what are advantages of investigating near miss cases?
Thank you, Dr. Pragati. The advantages of investigating the near miss events, they are multifold. First of all, these near miss cases, they give us an opportunity to go to the root cause of the event and find out the vital information which we would have been missing otherwise. Second important thing, it helps us to know the impending signs and symptoms which are very helpful in managing the recurrence in that patient. The third important point is, again, it is very important to investigate such cases because they will help us to guide us in managing our other patients. At the same time, when it provides patient safety, it also provides the doctor safety, and it creates a sort of good patient caring environment in the hospital, which is useful in long way.
Yeah, because this patient survives, so we can have a very good follow-up of all the management protocols which we have applied.
One thing I would like to add over here, these cases should be investigated as soon as possible so that we can get to the root cause of it.
Yeah, so as there is audit for maternal mortality, there should be audit for near-miss cases also. So what are indications for transferring a patient to ICU, Dr. Chaitanya?
When to refer the patient and what are the indications for referring a patient to obstetric ICU. We have 3 levels, we do routine obstetric in our hospital setup. We have HDU and then we have ICU. Whenever 2 or more organs are involved, then you must refer the patient to an obstetric intensive care unit. Apart from that, if you require invasive monitoring, ventilatory support, if anadrops are required, if massive transfusion is required, renal replacement therapy is needed, or if there is a risk of sudden catastrophic deterioration, you have to refer the patient to obstetric ICU. When you require multidisciplinary approach, like you need anesthesiologist, you need intensivist, a physician, and all this teamwork can do very well if you have an obstetric ICU setup.
So when there are low resource setting, you don't have all the facilities, and to save a mother, we should not hesitate to take help of all our colleagues and should take multidisciplinary help. So we proceed to first case. She is second gravida, para 1 with no live issue, 37 weeks with low-lying placenta with previous cesarean section 3 years back for CPD. She was taken for elective cesarean section. There was no history of bleeding PV and genitally throughout. And she had uneventful antenatal period. Her first baby expired at age of 2 years of viral pneumonia. All investigations were normal. Her USG showed single live pregnancy of 37 weeks with vertex presentation with low-lying placenta, 20 mm from internal os, lying on anterior wall with no evidence of invasion. So, Dr. Sumit, how will you proceed in such case?
This patient is a case of low-lying placenta in a case of previous cesarean section, and that to an anterior low-lying placenta. So the first and the most important thing in this case is to rule out the invasion of placenta, which you have already mentioned on the ultrasound that there is no evidence of any invasion of placenta. Because in cases of previous cesarean sections, the risk of placenta accreta syndrome spectrum is quite high as the number of previous cesarean sections increases. So whenever we are planning cesarean section, in these cases of anterior low-lying placenta, the next important thing will be counseling of the patient for the risk of hemorrhage, risk of need for blood and blood product transfusion. Then there will be a possibility of leaving the placenta inside if we are not able to deliver it, and the possibility of obstetric hysterectomy has also to be explained to the relatives. So preparedness is the most important thing before going for any such surgery.
Very rightly said. Preparedness is very important for any case who has previous C-section. So she became a high-risk patient. So intraoperative, there were adhesions present. Lower segment was vascular. Bleeding was more than average. Placenta was tried to remove, but it came out partially in piecemeal. Attempt to remove increased bleeding. Uterus was getting atonic intermittently. Bilateral uterines and ovarian arteries were ligated. Bleeding was not controlled. Placenta was not coming out. So decision for closing was taken after giving few hemostatic sutures. Abdomen was closed with placenta bits in situ after counseling with relatives. Post-operatively, patient had bleeding PV and clots continuously. Medical management continued. Balloon tamponade was done. Close monitoring was done, but bleeding PV continued. She was not ready for obstetric hysterectomy as she had no live issues. 4 units of PRCs and 2 FFPs and PRPs were given, and patient was shifted to ICU. Within 6 hours, gradually the bleeding stopped. But patient was given injection methotrexate in view of retained placental pieces, 50 mg IV for 5 days and then weekly for 4 doses. She had bleeding PV off and on for 2 months and gradually bleeding stopped. And she gave history of expulsing pieces of placenta. Serial USG was monitored and gradually it disappeared after 4 months. So this was the case with focal placenta accreta. So what ANC workup will you do for low-lying placenta, Dr. Sumit?
Basically, antenatal diagnosis of low-lying placenta is important so that we can monitor and follow up these patients serially. The risk factors, like we have already mentioned, previous cesarean section is there, then we have to be more cautious about localizing the placenta. During the anomaly scan, around 18 to 20 weeks, placental localization is an important thing to identify the women who are at risk for developing and continuing to have low-lying placenta. So if low-lying placenta is diagnosed at the anomaly scan, then these patients should be followed up at 32 weeks by ultrasound scan to diagnose persistent low-lying placenta. The second important point will be prevention of anemia and treatment of anemia during the antenatal periods.
Dr. Ashish, next question is for you. What intraoperative steps will you take when you detect a patient with placenta accreta or adherent placenta?
In today's scenario, the most important cause for the obstetric history is the adherent placenta. It may range from the simple adherent placenta up to the placenta accreta, and you may get any type of the surprise, and it's your duty to be ready for any of the situation. Many times you may go for the elective obstetric hysterectomy without touching the placenta. Take the baby out by the classical incision, take the baby out, and without touching the placenta, you can straightforward go for the obstetric hysterectomy. But every time you are not lucky like this. Sometimes you give the incision for the cesarean section, you have to enter in the placenta because there is no alternative. You have to cut the placenta, take the baby out, and after that, when you find that the placenta is morbidly adherent, then in that situation, you have to take the placenta out, and if there is excessive bleeding and it cannot be managed by the conservative ways, then you have to go for the obstetric hysterectomy.
So, Dr. Ashish, how are your experience with obstetric hysterectomy complication rates?
Obstetric hysterectomy, because the situation where you have to perform the obstetric hysterectomy is really a painful situation. Everywhere there is bleeding, from all the sinuses there is bleeding. And second thing, because of the effect of this adhesion of the placenta, even most of the time, this bladder is also adherent, or there might be the invasion of the placenta in the bladder. Then in that situation, the dissection of the bladder away from the uterus, it also poses the problem. Most of the time, the recommendation is to do the total obstetric hysterectomy. But if the situation does not permit, then you may go for the subtotal type. But in the Indian scenario, if the post-op follow-up is not there, therefore this total hysterectomy is always recommended. Then you have to take care about the ureters while applying the clamp, because of as the patient is bleeding, then you are always in the hurry to apply the clamps and to stop the bleeding, and in that situation you may accidentally include the ureter in your clamps.
So we have to be very careful, and if we need help, we should take help of neurosurgeons. Call them if at all it is needed. Is there any role of interventional radiology in placenta accreta spectrum? Dr. Sumit?
There have been many small studies which have been describing about the role of interventional radiology in placenta accreta syndrome, but the current evidence is insufficient to make a firm recommendation. But then perioperative localization of the placental edge and taking an incision above that placental edge to prevent bleeding, and pelvic devascularization by inflating the radiologically inserted pre-placed devices in the bilateral internal iliac arteries have been described.
How does retained placenta behaves? Is there any role of methotrexate, Dr. Rajsi?
If it is just a retained placenta, and at this point of time if it is not bleeding, then the golden rule is just do not touch it. Let it be in situ, close the patient and monitor her. In all probability, by the end of puerperium, the placenta is thrown out, expelled spontaneously, or it is autolyzed completely. We have a challenge when the patient patient is bleeding. In such cases, you have to look up for things like either interventional radiology procedures, or you may give methotrexate. Currently, there are no randomized controlled trials to support the evidence of giving methotrexate, but empirically it is given and it has shown some good result in many cases. So we can take that option with proper due consent and monitoring of our lab parameters.
Even closing and subsequent hysterectomy can be a better option than obstetric hysterectomy when the conditions are under control. Yeah. Which imaging modality is best to rule out adherent placenta, Dr. Chaitanya?
If you think of imaging modality, the first thing that comes to your mind is, of course, ultrasound. You cannot imagine life without ultrasound. For obstetricians especially, ultrasound is like a stethoscope, and you must have an ultrasound. Even if you are working in a rural area, in a low resource setting, without ultrasound, I think you should not think of practicing or doing any obstetric work. If you add color to it, I mean if you have a color Doppler, then it plays a very crucial role, and especially in this case where you have a placenta accreta suspected, ultrasound along with color Doppler is the best combination. In most of the cases, this is a sufficient investigation which is going to give you idea about the invasion of the placenta and whether you have to be prepared for any emergency. That idea can be, you get this idea from doing a good ultrasound with a color Doppler. But I must add one point here, that MRI is a modality which is upcoming and is becoming more and more important in obstetric practice and also in gynec practice. MRI is especially important where there is a confusion as far as ultrasound is concerned, or if you want to be double sure that you are not missing something, then MRI is the best thing. The only problem with MRI is a cost factor, and maybe it is not available everywhere, but otherwise MRI is doing the best reporting, and you get to know so many things from MRI. Especially if there is a posterior placenta accreta, then MRI is indicated for better diagnosis.
And sometimes patients are so obese that they are not able to find out that
Ultrasound may not help in the obese patients. So with obesity and difficulty in diagnosis, posterior placenta MRI may be a helpful procedure.
If undiagnosed adherent placenta with facility not prepared, Shantala, so what will be the things? If you are at a PHC and you found a patient, what will you do?
Thank you, Dr. Pragati, for this question. As already discussed by the panelists, it is always important that we should be prepared and we should try and diagnose this adherent placenta beforehand so that we can treat these patients at a tertiary center. But if it is undiagnosed and we have delivered the baby out, and if the patient is stable, we can always close the uterine incision, close the abdomen and refer the patient to a tertiary center. The problem happens when the patient is unstable and she is bleeding. That is when we should call for help, call for expert help so that they can assist us. At the same time, it is important to arrange for blood and blood products and stabilize the patient. Along with that, we have to counsel the family regarding that we may have to go in for an obstetric hysterectomy if needed. It is also, there have been instances where uterus preserving surgeries like uterine artery embolization and internal iliac ligation, etc., have been tried in selected cases as well.
What lessons are learned from this case, Dr. Alka?
First of all, one should be well prepared for the calamity. Yes.
Antenatal workup and placental mapping is important. Role of methotrexate is controversial, but we can try. If not bleeding, leave placenta in situ, close hysterectomy and wait for or perform delayed hysterectomy, and close monitoring for secondary hemorrhage and sepsis is must. So here we go to our second case. This is a 21-year-old primey, 39 weeks. She underwent forceps delivery for prolonged second stage. Bleeding PV was more than average. Uterotonics and medical management was given. On examination, patient was exhausted. Pulse was 96 per minute. Blood pressure was 110/70. Uterus was atonic intermittently and there were no tears. Cervix was explored. It was found intact. Big episiotomy was sutured and patient was shifted to ward. But bleeding PV was present. Balloon tamponade was done with condom catheter. After 1 hour, patient complained of pain at episiotomy site. Uterus was well contracted. Bleeding PV was average. Analgesics were given, IV fluids, antibiotic and monitoring continued. PRCs were called. But After some time, patient was found to be in shock with tachycardia and blood pressure 80/50. Patient was drowsy, pulse rate was 120. So, what is the cause for this, Dr. Rajasi?
So this type of picture, most common diagnosis which we would think would be a pelvic hematoma, a deep dissecting hematoma at the site of the episiotomy. And as we all know, hematomas can be quite treacherous. What we see on the exterior, on the perineum, may just be a tip of the iceberg, and patient may have collected a huge amount of blood inside internally, and she may actually land up in shock or even a fatality. So, inspection of the site locally is extremely crucial in such patients.
So when she was examined, a huge swelling of 15/15 centimeter on lateral vaginal wall on right side, extending posteriorly, and in vaginal cavity, which was tender and boggy. So it was a pelvic hematoma which was explored. Why are pelvic hematomas bad, Dr. Rasi?
That's because, as I said, they are very treacherous, they are detected late. What we see on the exterior, if we do not do an internal examination, we may very well miss hematomas. And they are capable because the pelvic tissue is such that there is a lot of free areolar space above the elevator ani. So they can accommodate a large amount of blood before patient starts showing symptoms and signs in her vitals.
Shall I add something?
Yeah.
I think if you just go as far as clinical things are concerned, we always monitor the patients after delivery and confirm that the patient has passed routine. And this is something which has got a practical importance because that gives you idea about whether there is a hematoma.
The fourth stage monitoring is most important phase where you pick up all these things. So how to manage and prevent postpartum hemorrhage after normal labor, Dr. Alka?
In this question, there are two parts. First of all, prevention of PPH, and second one is the management. Prevention will start from the ANC antenatal period. During antenatal period, one has to look for the high-risk cases and treat and prevent anemia in those patients. Second thing, even though you investigate that patient is high risk, still there are chances that each and every patient can bleed, can land up in PPH. So, the another point in antenatal thing is one should be well prepared with the stocks of medicines, with all the trays ready for the PPH trays should be ready, along with the balloon catheter. During labor, the monitoring again is very important. We should monitor the patient with partograph. We should not allow the patient to go in post prolonged labor. We should not we should not allow our patient to land up in PROM and PPROM. Then we should have during labor we should allow the patient to gradually dilate. Cervix should not be forcefully dilated. And during delivery, we should not stretch and push the cervix. Do not give fundal pressures. At the same time, episiotomy should be selective. We usually do not give episiotomy in all patients. There should be a selective use of episiotomy and proper assessment of proper monitoring of labor. And during third stage of labor, this AMT-XL should be practiced. That is active management of third stage of labor. In active management of third stage of labor, there are 3 steps. One is the massaging of uterus, giving oxytocin, and control contraction. These are very important. During after delivery, then one should see the vulva, vagina, and cervix for any tears or any episiotomy extension, and properly evacuate the uterus. And after that comes the management. In management, yes. Yeah. Should I go ahead? In management, management depends on the tonicity and traumatic preparation. The 4 T's are very important: tone, tissue, trauma, and thrombin. So we should rule out each and everything and manage accordingly.
Whenever you see that there is a patient who is at a high risk of getting into PPH, just have a high index of suspicion like an Rh negative, a previous cesarean, a hypertensive, hypothyroid, anemic. Please arrange at least 1 unit of blood when she is in labor in your setup.
So, as we were talking about pelvic hematomas, this is a very favorite slide of mine. Here we can see the pelvic pudendal vessel. Pelvis is so vascular. As Dr. Rassier said, there are areolar tissues, there are adipose tissues, ischiorectal fossa, which facilitate labor, which facilitate defecation. So, because of this dead space, there are chances that there can be collection which is not noticed. Deadly, there will be collection, and when the patient is revealed that she is having shock, already lot of concealed hemorrhage has already taken place, and because of close proximity of anal canal, there can be infection and it can flare up. Here we can see in this picture, this is pudendal vessel and there is levator ani muscle which divides infralevator and supralevator compartments. These infralevator hematomas can be detected somehow as a swelling in vulva or vaginous tenesmus, retention of urine, or tenesmus in her perianal part. But pelvic hematomas which are supralevator are very difficult to detect and they may sometimes need laparotomy. So can you describe pelvic floor anatomy, Dr. Ashish?
If we describe the pelvic floor anatomy with respect to the hematoma, episiotomy hematoma or vulval hematoma, it can be either the supralevator or infralevator. In both the situations, there is lot of potential space available for the hematoma to grow. A volume of more than 1 liter of the hematoma is not a surprise to see in both of the types. If infralevator hematoma is there, mostly it is because of the trauma to the pudendal vessels. Then there is tendency to grow that hematoma in the ischiorectal fossa, but it is somewhat easier to manage. If it is of the higher level, that is the supralevator, most of the time the vaginal vessels or supragluteal artery, these vessels are involved, trauma to these vessels are there, and there is a tendency of the hematoma to increase in the pararectal space, and every time it's not possible to manage it vaginally. Sometimes laparotomy is also required, and anatomically it is more tricky because in that situation you have to always delimit the course of the urine. When you explore the hematoma, what happens? The tissue is already discolored, everything is black or dusky, and you are not lucky to trace out the origin of the vessel or origin of the hematoma. Then in that situation, give the copious wash with saline and see if you can see the source. If you are lucky, then clip the source. If you are not lucky, then just keep the drain. Reduce the dead space by keeping the drain.
I just wanted to discuss one case which I saw. There was a pelvic hematoma and that patient came to me, which was managed at PHC. Hematoma was drained and there was a pack kept in the hematoma cavity. So a lesson to learn is to pack vagina, not the hematoma cavity. So Dr. Sumit, how will you manage?
The most important thing will be firstly, because the patient might be in shock, so stabilization of the patient, and then taking the patient to OT, proper positioning and lighting and proper exposure to locate the bleeder. And as sir has already discussed, that it might be difficult because the tissues will be friable, so locating the bleeder and ligating it.
So like there is always a consensus for selective episiotomy. So how many of you give routine episiotomy? Like I would like to know from all the panelists.
No, we don't give routine.
Selective episiotomy.
Selective.
Dr. Shantala.
So I remember when we were trained, we used to give episiotomy routinely, especially in primary patients. But now we all know that there is conflicting evidence regarding the protective effect of episiotomy. Especially, we used to give it to prevent the occurrence of obstetric anal sphincter injuries. So now we have to plan, and we have to only give episiotomy if we are anticipating some vaginal instrumental procedures, etc. More important is to support the perineum well when the baby is crowning, and also we can give warm compresses during the second stage of of labor at the end of it. And if we have to give an episiotomy, it should be a mediolateral episiotomy. It is also,
Yeah, it has to be a selective episiotomy.
Yes, it should be selective episiotomy. The baby should be delivered gradually and slowly.
Not only we have to support the perineum, we have to support the periurethral tissue also.
Yes.
Restrictive use of episiotomy is what is important.
Then to ragged tears to be repaired, it's better to do a clean cut episiotomy and secure the pelvic tear. That is what I feel. So RCOG recommendation is episiotomy is always conflicting. Mediolateral episiotomy is in instrumental deliveries and perineal protection at crowning. Warm compresses. RCOG recommend warm compresses during second stage can lower the risk of PPH and obstetric anal sphincter tears. OSS can be repaired in delivery room in presence of a senior obstetrician. Whenever you are doing a tear repair or an episiotomy repair, the place should be well lit, proper position, proper relaxation of the patient, and then do the repair. Otherwise, there can be hematomas in the episiotomy or in the tear. So we have to be very careful and do a PR examination after every labor to rule out any rectal mucosal injury or any suture found in the rectal mucosa, and if it's found, remove it there and then to prevent VRFs. This we have already discussed. So what lessons we learned, Dr. Rasi?
So the fourth stage monitoring is almost as equally important as all the previous three stages. Looking at the patient's vitals and also a local examination, just a look at her episiotomy if anything has been given is also important. Yes. In case she has retention, of urine or inability to pass stools, that also deserves our attention to the local area.
I want to add.
This is a very practical point which you have mentioned. Many times we are busy practitioners and we tend to ignore to the complaints by the relatives of the patients. But every silly complaint should be, addressed because you never know. Yeah, you never know. It can be a serious problem.
And even during management of atonic PPH, there can be traumatic PPH. There can be iatrogenic causes. Like in this patient, it was an episiotomy hematoma. Yes, Dr. Alka?
Yes. Here I wanted to add the practice of giving tight pad bandage is very good in our country as such.
So moving towards our third case, she is a primey, 27 weeks, with history of watery discharge per vaginum since 6 hours. She has no history of pain in abdomen. She visited to a PSC and on examination, vitals were stable. Per abdomen, she was 26 weeks, uterus was relaxed, FHS were 144 per minute. PS, there was clear leak. Per vaginum, cervix was soft and dilated. Her total counts were sent, which were 15,000 per cubic mm, and hemoglobin was 9 gram %. Her USG revealed single live intrauterine pregnancy of 26 weeks with oligohydramnios, baby weight 620 gram. This patient was given tablet erythromycin and was advised to go to a higher center. Patient reached to a higher center, but after 3 days staying at home with complaints of fever and chills, headache, low abdominal pain, nausea and vomiting. Patient looked toxic. She was tachypnic with a respiratory rate of 28 per minute. She was febrile. Her blood pressure was 90/60, pulse was 120, SpO2 was 97%, and she had signs of moderate dehydration. Chest were clear, heart sounds were pure. Per abdomen, she was 26 weeks. Uterus was irritable, FHS were 120 per minute. Cervix was soft, which was admitting a tip of finger. Vagina was hot and there was no foul smell. Antibiotic cover was given. She was given cefazolin, amikacin, metrogyl, and augmented with tablet Mesoprost 200 microgram per vaginum 4-hourly. Patient delivered after 10 hours, fresh stillborn of 560 grams. Bleeding PV was more than average and foul smell was present by then. Next day, patient was febrile. She was in shock. Her blood pressure came to 80/50, tachycardia, respiratory rate increased to 30. She was deteriorating. She had bout of bleeding PV, abdominal pain, abdominal distension. Total counts raised to 23,000, serum lactate 12 millimoles per liter, CRP was 65, acidosis 7.1, platelets 47,000, blood sugar 238, X-ray chest was hazy. So patient was in septic shock. 5th day, coagulation profile also deranged. Patient developed ARDS, bleeding PV continued, and patient had fever, pain continued, and she was shifted to ICU. And she required PRPs. Patient was intubated, she was ventilated, and she required inotropic support. So what went wrong in this case, Dr. Chaitanya?
I think, Pragati, this is a classical case of how the things can go wrong and how the things could have been avoided. I think what is important is how to avoid this situation, and we should discuss that. When we started this discussing this case, it is very evident that patient came to the hospital in time. She went to the hospital within 6 hours of leaking, and she went to PHC. So I think there is a human angle to this case, and a part of counseling which plays a crucial role in this. If she has gone to a primary health center, which is a rural center with a small village, every doctor should be in touch with every patient, and he is not only a doctor, he is actually a family physician. So it is his duty to see to it that a patient is referred and patient is going properly to the center in a given stipulated time. What happened exactly is patient was given erythromycin. So maybe the diagnosis was good. You just put a speculum, see that there is a leaking. If there is a leaking, it is confirmed. You may send a vaginal swab, blood culture, basic investigations, and may think of actually conservative management after discussing this case with the relatives and the patient. So what went wrong is patient went home, and she went to the higher center or tertiary center after 3 days. So this very important crucial period was lost. She was at home, and at home you can understand the hygienic conditions of the patient, and this ultimately led to the infection, and patient landed in septic shock. So I think the first thing is the golden hour, which is important, and you would have prevented chorioamnionitis in this case. In fact, we could have even conservatively managed this patient if we would have diagnosed it early and started treatment at the early.
There was delay and there was lack of communication. So whenever we are referring a patient to a higher center or to a tertiary care center, it is onus of the person who is referring that you make a good communication with the team and just see to it that patient goes. Because when she came that time, she was not bad, but then how she deteriorated, and she required a ventilatory support.
Yes, and I think Pragati, the treatment started was correct. Erythromycin is the drug of choice whenever there is a PROM. That is how they started it. But the patient did not go to the higher center. That's the problem.
So what are the tools to diagnose sepsis, Dr. Ashish?
Since either it can be diagnosed either on the examination of the patient, that is the clinical condition, or on the laboratory basis. The most important is by even doing the simple clinical examination, you can diagnose the sepsis. There are important indicators like the respiratory rate, or what is the mental alertness of the patient, or the simple this blood pressure or the pulse rate. Even these simple tools you can use to diagnose the sepsis.
Score. Even without touching a patient, I said respiratory rate, you don't even require to touch the patient, and it gives you insight if that patient having respiratory rate of more than 24 or 26, she is dyspneic. It's an indicator that something is going wrong and we have to alert the red flag. So whenever SOFA score, which is quick sequential organ failure assessment score of more than 2, that is respiratory rate more than 22, change in mental state, patient is drowsy, or systolic blood pressure is less than 100 mm, we should be very alert, and even there are other scoring systems to know that patient is in sepsis. So other features like fever, rigor, she also had abdominal pain, she had headache, sometimes patient present with shock. There is chances of chorioamnionitis in this patient, offensive vaginal discharge, and even patient can come in cough or urinary symptoms because of generalized sepsis. So what diagnostic modalities can be used in an antenatal patient with history of fever for more than 3 days and she is not responding to oral PCM first generation antibiotics? Anybody can take. Patient has a fever and she is given antibiotics and she is not responded for 3 days for any ANC patient. So how should we proceed?
But for such kind of patient, we usually give the fourth generation antibiotics, which include the tazobactam, amikacin, and along with metronidazole for anaerobic coverage. We can send this blood culture for these patients after prior to antibiotic administration, basically. But these patients, they usually receive antibiotic before coming to us. So still we send the blood culture along with CBC, then liver function test, kidney function test, and urine routine and urine culture for sensitivity. High vaginal swab should be taken in these patients, and if the findings are suggestive of some electrolyte imbalance, one can send with the electrolytes and coagulation profile, because high risk of DIC is there.
This was for regarding this patient, but really I wanted to know from the house regarding the use of antibiotics. If a routine ANC patient comes to us with just fever, so what should be our approach? A patient with fever of 3 days, should we start her on higher antibiotics, or we should require some antibiotic preparedness? Because we have to leave some antibiotics for our future generations also, and antibiotic resistance is coming as one of the important cause, other than this case.
Agreed to you, but still pregnancy itself is an immunocompromised condition, and we cannot take chances if the patient is having fever already for 3 days. In that case, we start investigating the patients and start antibiotic accordingly.
So in this patient who has come in sepsis, how will you plan medical and obstetric management, Dr. Sumit?
First and the foremost important thing in these cases with sepsis, with shock, patient coming with septic shock, presenting like a septic shock, it has to be a multidisciplinary team approach with involvement of critical care team, obstetrician and infectious disease consultant also. And starting of broad spectrum antibiotic in 1 hour of the patient coming to the hospital, and after taking the blood cultures. So firstly the blood culture should be taken, routine blood test, and starting of antibiotics. Then serum lactate is one more important thing in which should be done in these cases of septic shock, because serum lactate within 6 hours of severe sepsis, if it is more than 4 millimoles per liter, it indicates tissue hypoperfusion and need for fluid resuscitation.
In this patient, will you like to terminate medically or surgically, Dr. Alka? She was 27 weeks.
As patient is already in sepsis, I won't prefer surgery in these patients. I will prefer her to terminate her pregnancy by medical means.
I think this is a controversial point, and you need to discuss the salvageability of the baby as well, and discuss with the relatives whether they wish to go for cesarean section or not. And you have to, as a senior obstetrician, you have to take the decision. So it depends on many factors, like the possible availability of the NICU care at your setup or in your town is also something which plays a crucial role. And then you have to also think of giving steroids to this patient, magnesium sulfate to the patient, and so that the baby is in a good state. And you may prolong it for 48 hours so that the patient is hemodynamically stable. And then I personally feel that at 27 weeks, it is always better to go for C-section, because the baby at our setup, like, we can definitely salvage a baby.
I would like to differ over here. The baby weight is only 560 grams and it's 27 weeks, and the fetal heart rate, as you have shown, it is 120 per minute. So in this case, salvageability of the baby is not there as such.
So I'd like to conclude by saying that in any critically ill pregnant patient, the birth of the baby, it should be decided by whether it is going to be beneficial for the mother's outcome or mother's to improve the mother's condition.
Rather than the child.
And with our medical management, whatever we are doing after giving antibiotics, if the mother is improving, naturally the baby is also improving. That is taken for granted.
So this is a controversial issue ki you want to save the mother or save the baby. So we are looking forward to save the mother then, and taking up a surgical risk is surgical cause undercover is also equally difficult also, because this patient was in sepsis where her platelet counts were also reduced. But again, losing time for medical induction is again going to cause a problem, and her sepsis will deteriorate, because removing the septic focus, because this patient had chorioamnionitis, as the septic focus is removed, the patient will recover. So we are saving the time. So depending on your institution and the facilities available, you have to see for the recovery for the mother and the baby. Is it difficult to identify sepsis in a pregnant patient, Shantala?
Actually, the physiological changes that happen in normal pregnancy might make it very difficult, at least initially, to identify the signs of sepsis. During pregnancy, there is increased plasma volume, there is compensatory raised heart rate, there is reduced vascular resistance. So because of this, subtle signs of sepsis like tachycardia and changes in blood pressure or temperature may be missed. So we have to be very, very vigilant in monitoring these patients. Also, we have limited options for imaging in pregnancy. So that can be a deterrent in diagnosing a sepsis.
So high index of suspicion should be there whenever we have a patient. If she is high risk patient, she gives fever, her modified early obstetric warning score or mu score, it helps us. And a tachycardia is a very specific marker. Tachypnea and tachycardia, which point that the patient is in sepsis. Which antibiotics are empirically used in sepsis, Dr. Alka?
The fourth generation antibiotics they are used like cefazolin, metronidazole, clindamycin, coamoxiclav, pipzo or tazobactam combination, and gentamicin.
Shall I add one thing here?
Yes.
Pragati, amoxiclav is known to have caused necrotizing enterocolitis, and that's the reason why I think piperacillin tazobactam is something which is preferred.
Cefazolin, metrogil and amikacin is considered as a very good combination for cover gram-negative positive and anaerobics.
And gentamicin, you can give one dose of gentamicin safely, even if you don't have a renal function test available with you.
Yeah, even nowadays, prophylactic antibiotic, one dose of cefazolin prophylactically during seizure is widely practiced to prevent sepsis. So lesson learned is we should deliver the patient at the earliest when there is any septic focus. We should give a good antibiotic coverage, and we should try to prevent organ failures. Yeah, please.
Just in continuation with Dr. Shanti said, the signs and symptoms and diagnosis of sepsis in pregnancy becomes very difficult, as she correctly said, because it may be
Marked, yeah.
So, good two markers to diagnose sepsis can be CRP, C-reactive protein, and procalcitonin. If you could just monitor your patient with serial follow-up of these two markers, you can very well diagnose sepsis in the first place and monitor your patient. Because a VLC count, a total leukocyte count of up to 15,000 may be normal in pregnancy, and many times if they are actually presenting in late shock, they may not have as much high range of fevers. So we may miss it. But CRP and PCT are two markers which are extremely sensitive, and they are not very expensive also.
Actually, this COVID has really increased our vision for managing sepsis, and we are more now prone to all the diagnostic facilities because of COVID. Very true. This is the last case. She is 22 years, primary, 30 weeks, came with acute onset breathlessness since 2 hours. She had history of COVID 1 month back, which was asymptomatic, and she was managed at home. On examination, GC was not fair. She was well oriented and responding. Her pulse was 120 per minute, blood pressure was 160 by 100, respiratory rate was 36, and her SpO2 was 60%. She had pallor, edema, there was no icterus, DTR were brisk, chest showed bilateral cracks. Because she had history of COVID, she was, she was not taken in any hospital, and she was always referred to a COVID care center. Her abdominally, she was 30 weeks, FHS was 140 per minute, and uterus was well relaxed, no leaking and no bleeding. What comes to your mind when you see such patient, Dr. Alka?
There are many conditions which mimic such kind of. One has to monitor the patient. First of all, I will admit her and monitor her regarding this. But she is having bilateral crepitations, as you have said. In emergency management, my management will go for injectable Lasix. Oxygen. Yes. Along with injection Lasix. And once she settled, I will manage her accordingly. accordingly.
So patient improved well with oxygen inhalation, LMWH and antibiotics. Her SpO2 increased to 90% just within 30 minutes. Her HRCT score was 7. Total counts were raised, KFT normal, hemoglobin was okay, albumin was 3+ and platelets were 1.4 lakhs. Coagulation profile normal, RT-PCR was negative for COVID. And USG showed single live intrauterine pregnancy of 30 weeks, placenta posterior not previa, weight was 1.2 kg, amniotic fluid was average, and there was increased PI in both the uterine arteries. Her echo suggested left ventricle systolic dysfunction with ejection fraction of 40%. Patient was escalated on tablet labetalol 20 mg TDS, injection labetalol in IV hydralazine, but her blood pressure was not responding and her blood pressure continued to be 190 by 120, 200 by 100. LMWH 80 units were given. Patient again had hypoxic episode with SpO2 78 and now patient was shifted to ICCU. She was maintained on BiPAP for 3 days and blood pressure was not controlled. This was a patient of severe PIH with query pulmonary embolism or pulmonary edema, query cardiac failure. Her echo were repeated, which showed again deterioration of ejection fraction to 30% with cardiomyopathy. So should pregnancy be terminated and how, Dr. Rajsi, in such cases?
First and foremost, at admission, pregnant lady, history of COVID, SpO2 60%, she should have been taken up in the ICU right away. Secondly, if we have to do an HRCT, in pregnancy, CT is not indicated, plus it is not giving us much information in terms of deciding our line of management. About this pregnancy, whether it should be terminated, well, for the cardiac reason, you need to first stabilize the patient, and of course, since she is severe preeclampsia, if you could buy about 24 hours till your steroids can act 24 to 48 hours, that would do good to the baby also. But yes, on the whole, she needs termination for the severe preeclampsia.
So in this case, because she has come in the era of COVID, she was more so thought of as a COVID and she was not taken by the centers that she is a COVID patient and she was not getting proper treatment, but her COVID profile was normal and this was a case of severe PIH presenting with cardiac failure due to cardiomyopathy, which was missed, and this is how some.
But any hypoxia, like 60% SpO2 is hypoxia. COVID or no COVID, she should have been taken in the ICU in the first place. So we could have monitored her better on the cardiac monitors that side.
So patient was ventilated for 3 days. She used to go on repeated failures. She was on heavy combination of antihypertensives and beta blockers. Repeat echo showed ejection fraction of 40%. She was taken for LSCS under general anesthesia. Baby was salvaged, mother was salvaged. She was on ventilator for 3 days and then she started recovering. But here this case was discussed just to show the importance of detecting cardiomyopathy at earliest, always predicting PIH, how it can present, the complications of PIH can predict. So there was always a dilemma in treating this case. This is a COVID complication or severe PIH complication.
So unless proved otherwise, we would label it as COVID complications. Considering that now we are looking at an entity called long COVID syndrome, which affects absolutely each and every organ. So cardiac failure and preeclampsia may have very well been precipitated by her previous episode of COVID.
Nowadays, with more and more patients coming for IVF, we get more such cases of advanced maternal age with PIH and diabetes and all other comorbidities. We at our center we do echo of all such patients at 32 weeks, and I think this is an important investigation which we all should do, especially in high risk cases.
Alka, want to add something?
I encountered one of my patients. She was discharged after a C-section. On 5th day, she was absolutely all right. On 3rd day, she had some tachycardia, and she was feeling restless. We did her ECG that day. We didn't did her echo, not suspected anything. We did her ECG, and ECG was normal. Physician saw her, and she went home. She after discharge, after 1.5 days, like 36 hours, she came back with restlessness and tachycardia and very dyspneic. she was not able to climb the staircase for 2 or 3 staircase. So she was lifted to my emergency room, and there the crepitations, and then she was diagnosed as postpartum cardiomyopathy. There was no pre-existing cause in this patient.
That is peripartum. Nowadays, it is said as peripartum cardiomyopathy, which can take place in last trimester or 5 months after delivery, and it present without any cardiac element, and it present as a cardiomyopathy, and we have to be very vigilant. So, what lessons we learn from this is, as Dr. Chaitanya said, we should add echo to our basket of investigations to prevent these type of catastrophe, other which we normally don't. We obstetricians are not in the habit of doing echos for our patient, so we should put in echo in our basket.
And we should ask them to use contraception, but these patients many times gets pregnant, and in that time it's very difficult to counsel them, but still I did medical abortion of this patient and she went good.
And one more very important thing is, in this patient, prolactin levels are increased. So these patients are not asked to breastfeed their babies, because it will lead to increase in prolactin, which will again lead to release of some inflammators, chemical inflammator, which will aggravate cardiomyopathy. So few patients, and even if patient is on ACE inhibitors, so these patients are advised to put baby on top fit. Does Dr. Rasi want to add something?
Did you say prolactin?
Prolactin. Bromocriptine is given to these patients for 7 days of patient with cardiomyopathy, and they have to be followed up. So, what lessons we learn from this case is Dr. Shantala?
Oxygen therapy is one of the mainstays of managing these patients. And we should try not to overdiagnose COVID. And as Dr. Rajasi has rightly said, she should be shifted to the ICU as soon as possible.
So, maternal mortality can be a very bad experience for the obstetrician. It can take away her name, fame, her career, her reputation. But near miss adds a lot to the community, to the society, to the country. And every obstetrician who is working for the patient is working for the cause, working for the country and for the globe. So we want to convert every mortality to near miss, and that is what we want to do. Thank you all to be part of this discussion. I am thankful to all the panelists for sparing their time and bringing out this wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of all the office bearers of NOGS, we thank FIGO for giving us this opportunity. Thank you.